My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. I have a bit of an update on my own life. I got a teaching job. That's right, I'm teaching at the University of Oregon. I'm an adjunct professor in the East Asian Languages and Literatures Department at my alma mater. Technically, my position is titled Pro Tem Instructor, but I'm an adjunct professor teaching in the department where I once was a student. Now, the student has become the master. What does it mean to be an adjunct professor? So it's like being a regular professor, but it's only for a year, and I get a crummy shared office. I don't get paid that much. And you know what? I could not be happier. I've spent the past month or two writing out my lectures. I actually recorded the previous 3 episodes sometime in July or August, and I've been traveling some and working on my lectures for class since then. So this is the first time I've recorded in a month or two. I'm having a ton of fun writing out all of my lectures. Just yesterday, I got to teach my first 100-person lecture, and I had forgotten how much fun I love teaching at the college level. Me getting a job at the UO shouldn't affect the podcast, though I may end up covering lots of stuff that is part of my coursework, just, 2 birds, 1 stone. Not this quarter. I'm teaching Chinese film, and then the next quarter I'll be teaching Chinese popular culture, Chinese narrative. Yes, the University of Oregon has a course that covers 3,500 years of Chinese prose, all in one measly course. I'm also going to do a course on Taiwanese literature and Taiwanese film. I may also be helping out a group in Taiwan, produce some podcasts for them. That would be part of a paid gig. I'm not exactly sure what form that will take. We're still in the middle of negotiations, but I just wanted to update y'all on that. Now, let's drop back into part 2 of my series on the book of poetry, the classic of poetry, the Shijing, whatever we are calling it. Today, I'm going to be talking about a poem whose title I am translating it as Those Tender Peaches. Peaches, that fruit that was domesticated in what is today China's Zhejiang province around 2000 BC. At the time, of course, that these poems are being written down, Zhejiang is not part of China. The authors would not have thought of Zhejiang as being part of the Chinese sphere. They would have thought of it as part of the barbarian world, but they would have likely had contact with peaches for several hundred years in terms of trade. The poem, Those Tender Peaches, is interesting for a couple of reasons. First, it's interesting as an exploration of the understandings of sexuality and gender from about 3 millennia ago. These poems are written down probably 1000 BC, 800 BC, something like that. So just kind of getting a look at how gender, how sexuality works, I think is interesting. Second, it also speaks to the question that I brought up in the last podcast about translation and how we should understand these poems. For today's episode, I'm going to read my translation of this poem, but I'm also going to read my translation of Baidu's translation of this poem into modern Chinese. Hang on, that was a bit confusing. Let me say that again. I will share both my translation of the poem, Those Tender Peaches, and I will also share the translation done by Baidu. Baidu, the tech search engine giant, translated the exact same poem from classical Chinese, that is, Wenyan into modern Chinese. This is something they do frequently for poems as a part of their Baidu Baike, the Baidu Encyclopedia, essentially China's heavily policed and heavily censored form of Wikipedia. I took the poem that they translated into modern Chinese, and I translated that from modern Chinese into English. So we'll look at both of those examples just to compare them and see how different translations can be and how we can have disagreements on which, there can be a wrong translation, but there can never be a right translation. Both Baidu's translation and my translation, I think, are valuable and valid. But before we get into the poem, I want to give a little bit more background information. Last episode, I talked a bit about the Shijing's poem, The Big Rat, and I was afraid I was going too deep into exposition. So I had a listener actually tell me no, they really liked all that exposition. It helped give them the context. So I'm going to do a little bit more exposition in this episode. The poems of the Shijing have been placed into 4 categories. Keep in mind that these categories were probably invented 1,000 years after the poems were written down and collected. The categories themselves are probably conceived of sometime in the Han Dynasty. That's, from 200 BC to 200 AD. These poems, like I said, are being written down and collected 1000 BC, 800 BC. How valuable the categories are, I don't know. But they are important to know about because they inform much later thinking on the poetry. Whether or not they reflect anything from the poems themselves, they reflect something of the tradition, the Chinese literary tradition, and how it has come to understand these poems. So the 4 categories of poems are guofeng, something literally like winds of the nation, but feng here, wind, has to be read more metaphorically. We can still use that in Chinese to mean something like style. So the guofeng poems are poems from different Zhou dynasty countries. So today's poem, Those Tender Peaches, is poem number 6 from the Zhounan category. These are poems selected from the southern portion of the original Zhou state. The Zhounan poems include other poems. Rob and I did a podcast on Guan Guan Goes the Osprey. That poem is from the Zhounan poems. So this handful of poems, the Zhounan Guofeng poems, are pretty important. But the southern Zhou, the Zhuonan poems, are not the only country represented. The Zhou dynasty was not a single state in the way we think of countries today. There was not a single executive with one single capital in some place with all power centralized into that space. In fact, it was much more, and I want to use this word carefully, the Zhou was feudal. There were multiple states and countries, power overlapped within the Zhou dynasty. So we don't just have the Zhou dynasty, the Zhuonan Guofeng poems. We also have the poems from the country of Wei. So the Big Rat is actually in the Wei poem collection. These are poems that supposedly were collected from people in the state of Wei. There are 3 other types of poems. The Xiaoya, that is the little elegancies, the Daya, the big elegancies, and the Song. These are encomiums, songs of praise, particularly about different states. The majority of all the 305 poems in the Shijing are from the Guofeng. 154 poems are from Guofeng, and the 151 poems outside of this are distributed in the 3 other categories. That's by my very quick count. The most important poems are usually in the Guofeng, though not all of them. Next episode, we'll talk about a poem called She Bore the Folk, which is from the Daya, the big elegancies. This is one of the earliest pieces of Chinese mythology that we have today. But this week, we are discussing Those Tender Peaches. In the last episode on The Big Rat, I talked about this. Just want to remind you, this is a poem that is written in an ancient version of ancient classical Chinese Wenyan. So it's even more ancient than Wenyan. It's a language that's impossible to read without the commentaries. We just do not have enough writing from these poems to actually understand them and to be able to really get a firm grip on the language. It is Chinese. When you look at the original Hanzi, the original Chinese characters, if you can read Chinese, you can see the connection. But you actually have to be trained in how to read these poems, both in terms of the different Hanzi, because the script itself has evolved quite a bit, and also the grammar has evolved quite a bit. If you aren't trained how to read these poems, it's going to be nearly impossible for you to understand what they mean. But there is a tension. We have these commentaries that tell us what the poems are supposed to mean, but they're written hundreds, if not thousands of years after the original poem was written. How do they know what's going on in the poem? We don't know. The distance between the commentaries and the original poems is as much as between us and medieval England, right? We wouldn't trust a commentator writing today on Middle English poetry. So how do we know what's going on in these poems for real? The short answer is we don't. But we don't have a better way of understanding these poems other than by using the commentaries. That said, we know that these commentaries all have reasons that they're writing these commentaries. And as every postmodern reader knows, do not trust a writer. So when we read these poems, we have to read the commentaries, but we can't completely trust them. They all had ideologies. They had a reason for saying whatever they're saying. Don't trust them. Okay, I've been banging on for too long. Even for people who like exposition, you're probably getting tired of this. So let's jump into the translations. First, I'm going to read my translation of the Baidu translation of the poem, and then I'll read my personal translation of the actual poem. So here's the Baidu translation. The peach blossoms are in full bloom, 100,000 flowers. Their color is red like a flame. The girl is getting married. She looks excited to go to her husband's house. The peach blossoms are in full bloom, 100,000 flowers. The clusters of fruit are big and sweet. The girl is getting married. She will soon give birth to honorable sons and be prosperous with descendants. The peach blossoms are in full bloom, 100,000 flowers. The green leaves are luxuriant and open following the winds. The girl is getting married. The husband's house will be peaceful and happy and at peace. So this is the PG version of the poem with all the nasty elements removed. And I am not using nasty in a pejorative manner, but rather in the Atlantan sense of the word, as I am an Atlantan. In that sense of the word, it just means having something to do with sex and sexuality. When I read Baidu's translation, I thought they pretty much Balderized the poem. They made it much cleaner than the poem should have been. They removed the nasty elements. So here's my translation of that very same poem. Them peaches are tender, tender, hot, hot in the bloom. The girl is getting hitched. Don't she fit this family? Them peaches are tender, tender. There are the fruits. The girl is getting hitched. Don't she fit this house? Them peaches are tender, tender. Its leaves are luxuriant. The girl is getting hitched. Don't she fit these folks? So what I was trying to do with this translation is highlight the sexual elements of the poem and also to use a language that didn't sound so highfalutin. I want people to think of these poems as folk poems. Even the commentaries say this is a folk poem, yet when they translate them, they oftentimes use highfalutin language. That includes both translations from the classical Chinese into modern Chinese and from classical Chinese into modern English. I don't think that fits. That's not what these poems are about. These poems are supposed to be folk poems, supposedly, and this is probably legendary, but nevertheless, it's important to think about. These poems were originally songs sung by farmers in the field. So why translate it in this highfalutin language that is only something that you would speak in the court with the king? It doesn't make sense to me. Another thing that doesn't make sense to me, why Balderize these poems? These poems are all about sex. The peach is clearly a metaphor for the suppleness, the fertility of this young girl who is about to get married. The first two lines of each of the three quatrains that make up this poem discuss the richness, the suppleness, the tenderness of the peach, the fecundity of this plant. It's hard not to recognize the metaphor here. The third and fourth lines say nothing of the peach. The poem discusses only the qualities of the girl, and usually these are something about her being socially appropriate, being a good fit with the family. These comments are never about her sexuality, and yet it doesn't matter because the way this poem works is by juxtaposing these two images side by side. The point of the poem, the meaning of the poem come out of that juxtaposition. So they don't have to say, this girl is really sexy. This girl can make a lot of babies. They've already done it by putting her right next to this fecund peach. There's actually a rap that was quite popular about 2 decades ago called Peaches and Cream. The group is from Atlanta. This seems to be a very Peach, Atlanta, Georgia flavored episode, so I'm just going to keep rolling with it. The group is called 112. The chorus of the song makes it clear what the song is about. Peaches and cream, I need it 'cause you know that I'm a fiend. Getting freaky in my Bentley limousine. It's better when it's with ice cream. Know what I mean? Of course we know exactly what he means. If you're still confused, please feel free to watch their music video, which makes it even more explicit. In various sequences, the camera looks first at peaches being poured into a glass bowl, and those shots are juxtaposed with a man and a woman lying atop each other, making out quite heavily on top of a car. There is almost no ambiguity in this rap. Okay, but that's a rap song from the early 2000s. What does this have to do with a Chinese poem written 3 millennia ago? Today, a lot of postmodernist and post-structuralist literature folk would question the idea that you can have something be universal. They'd say there's no such thing as a symbol that has a universal meaning. Certainly, many of them, including some of my teachers, would blow a gasket if they heard me suggesting that peaches might be a universal symbol of feminine sexuality. But that is exactly what I am suggesting. Universal is a pretty strong word, so maybe I'm going a bit too far with this, but I have to think there's something there. You have two cultures separated vastly by time and by space, and they are using the peach in the same way. I think the fact that there is this connection really highlights that this idea of universality has more to it than a lot of contemporary critics give it credit for. But then y'all are probably asking, but Lee, you just said that you cannot read these poems on your own. You have to read them with the commentaries. What do the commentaries say? Well, they side much more with the Baidu interpretation. The commentaries downplay all discussions of sex. You might be asking yourself, if that's the case, Lee, how can you explain this? You said you have to rely on the commentaries, but here you are dismissing the commentaries. Here's my defense. You do have to rely on the commentaries, but you can also never completely trust the commentaries. The men writing the commentaries always have their own ideologies baked into them. In the Han Dynasty, Confucianism, or the brand of Confucianism that became popular then and still kind of lives on today, those Confucianists did not like to talk about sex. Throughout much of the history of Confucianism, Confucianists have found it difficult to talk about the subject. They find it icky and they avoid discussing it. I think the reason these commentaries try and avoid discussing the obvious sexual nature of some of these poems is because they just didn't like the ick factor. For them, they couldn't talk about it, so they imagined these poems to be about something other than what they are obviously about. Okay, I think that's a good place to kind of start to wrap it up. We have 2 more episodes on the Shijing. I hope y'all are enjoying it. As usual, I'll put the translations up on the website. Take a look at them. I'll put my translation of the poem along with the translation of the Baidu translation. Today's line in Chinese, it's not a chengyu, but it's just 讨之夭夭，讨之夭夭，灼灼其华。Them peaches are tender, tender, hot, hot in the bloom. The first line of today's poem. If y'all like or don't like the podcast, please send me an email. I read them. I try and respond, especially when someone gives me an idea for a show, like the person who told me, no, we want more exposition. If y'all do like the podcast, consider showing your support through Patreon. It's ChineseLiteraturePodcast.com. My email is ChineseLiteraturePodcast@gmail.com. Thank you so much for listening. My name is Lee Moore, and this is the Chinese Literature Podcast. 再见.